In today's video, we're going to be making this walnut liquor cabinet with some unique patterns, and of course, I'll be putting my CNC to work, so all you woodworking peers can tell me how non-existent my woodworking skills are. And whether you hate CNCs or not, I hope you guys enjoy the video. I recently got into different types of bourbons and whiskeys, and they've been collecting on top of my fridge, so I figured it'd be time to make a liquor cabinet. But we'll get into that later, since I've already made a mistake. When I was cutting these door panels to size, I lost track of the grain orientation, so I ended up gluing the piece back on and then just sneaking up to it with the joiner. Every woodworker makes mistakes, but the difference between a good woodworker and a great woodworker is being able to stay calm and fix those mistakes. An hour later and everything was back on track. Another difference is paying attention to grain selection. I always try to make it flow the best I possibly can with the wood I have available. Tambour doors are something that always intrigued me, but they're also quite intimidating. I think it's because you gotta cut so many little pieces, 76 here to be exact. I recently saw a video by Johnny Builds where he added a 3D pattern to his tambour, and I knew I had to try it, and it was finally time to try this tambour myself. I absolutely love the CNC as it opens so many doors, so we're gonna take Johnny's idea and expand on it in my own version. Some may see it as cheating, but to me it's just another tool in the shop, as it still takes a long time to learn, and it allows me to do things I wouldn't normally be able to do. Nor would I have the endurance or want to carve a pattern into a piece of wood for multiple days. So onto the cloth. What kind of cloth do you use? I don't know the exact answer to this, but everyone I've seen do this pretty much uses 100% cotton cloth. So I just got this cotton cloth on Amazon, which I'll link everything I used in the description of this video. I also saw Yarmul's post a video on YouTube, and he actually used a thin piece of leather for his, and it looked pretty cool, but for this it'd probably get quite expensive, so go check out his video if you want to see that. And the only issue I had with the black fabric was the glue just stuck out like a sore thumb, so I misted a little water on it and kind of rubbed it off, and it cleaned up quite nicely. The first door went pretty smooth, and then the second door went even better. After I had a little bit of confidence and experience under my belt, it went smooth, I took my time, and I didn't get any glue on the back of the fabric. And since all these pieces probably look the same, I'll give you a little bit visual reference of what we're working on. So now we're going to add the texture to the back panel of the cabinet. We will be using our 1finity CNC, and I used double-sided tape to hold the project down. And this panel took a little bit over an hour, and I am grateful that I have a CNC because my back hurts just thinking about carving this thing by hand. And on the topic of advancing technology, at an old job I received some leadership and efficiency training, and one thing they mentioned that would ruin the team dynamics and efficiency of the workflow was the caveman. What's a caveman? Someone who is stuck in their ways and not willing to change or go with the flow of the times, or even adapt to new technologies or systems a company introduces. And that comment always kind of stuck with me, and pops in my head when I get negative comments about using machines that I have available to me. I don't take these comments personally, as I know they just don't understand or have a different way of thinking than I do. And that's totally fine, but in a world of advancing technologies, you can either get on the bus or be left in the dust by everyone else willing to learn and evolve. And back to making mistakes. So we're going to cut the top and bottom pieces of the cabinet. I used a 1/4" end mill for all this, and each one took roughly 30 minutes. I've been getting pretty good at 3D modeling, and for whatever reason I went into this one a little overconfident. I should have cut these out of a cheaper wood, not expensive walnut, just to test everything to make sure everything flowed correctly and that there would be enough room for everything. But I didn't, and this front groove actually slid pretty well with my little makeshift tambour tape thing here, and the back one was actually a little too snug, but that's something I could have fixed. But the real issue is I didn't account for the texture on the back of the tambour, so I wouldn't have room to add the French cleat. So I went back in the software, fixed the back radius, and added an extra inch of clearance so I could add the French cleat so we could hang this thing on the wall. I should have just made this simple mock-up right away like my wife suggested, but I usually know what's best, and here we are. Luckily I was able to save some of the wood and use it for different sections of the build. So now we gotta kind of notch out the edges of this back panel and just kind of round them off, as the CNC leaves round corners as it uses round CNC bits. Ah yes, the soothing sound of a rasp against wood. I used the CNC to create this channel so that it would sit into the top and bottom pieces, but I didn't want to overshoot it, so I used a shoulder plane to kind of knock it down and kind of sneak up on it to get it to fit in there nice and snug. And here's where the pieces come into play, where my overconfidence took over and I made a bunch of expensive walnut scraps. Luckily these were a perfect size and I had some pretty cool grain, so I decided to use them for that. Add a round over to the front, add a little bit of sanding to finesse it in there, and just like that, we have a perfect fit. Now let's move on to how this all got started. About 2 years ago in Texas, I was with a load of awesome makers from all over the US. For a maker build-off where we built 2 pieces of furniture, battled it out, and afterwards they were auctioned off for charity. At night though, after we built all day long, the guys I was with were all sipping on bourbon on the rocks, and I'm over here with the boring rum and coke, saying, man, I don't know how you guys just drink that stuff straight. I could never do that. They then proceeded to laugh, give me a hard time for my sody pop drink. We laughed some more, and from that point on, I was peer pressured into no longer drinking soda and random alcohol. I then got my first bourbon and made awkward faces throughout the entire drink, and then they suggested starting with something like an old fashioned, and then you need to acquire the taste. And being from Wisconsin, old fashions do not mean the same thing in other states as it does back home. I started sipping on an old fashioned which tasted nothing like I've ever had back home. And to you non-Wisconsinites, they typically add some type of soda, like a sweet or sour, versus everything else is pretty much just straight liquor with bitters and a garnish. I then expanded my palate with different forms of old fashions, and eventually it just clicked and I started collecting different types of whiskeys, noticing different flavors and aromas to each one. Then a year and a half later, I had 12 random bottles on top of my fridge, and when we'd stomp through the house, they would click together, and it quickly became pretty annoying, and then I decided they officially needed a home, and here we are, 2 years later, building a beautiful walnut cabinet. And this part of the build is where it became pretty scary. I've CNC'd a lot of things, but slapping this Tambour onto the CNC and just letting this thing carve for like an hour and a half was terrifying. Because I already had so much wood invested into this thing, time cutting all these slats, and I just could not imagine this thing going south at this point. And I did the same with the doors as I did with the back panel. I used the CNC to cut the tenon so that the Tambour would be able to slide throughout the top and bottom piece of the cabinet. And with the first panel complete and a little bit of confidence as it did not explode, that Tambour looks so cool with the texture on it. And then the second door went just as smooth. It was still pretty scary. I kind of built a jig for it and then wedged it in there kind of like Johnny did, and it worked pretty good. But again, when you have this much work into something, CNCs can go haywire and stuff can happen, but thankfully nothing went wrong here. And then my doors got a tiny bit out of square. I'm not sure if it was just because I had it on the CNC not perfect or what, so I made this quick jig to zip a little off the bottom and to make everything nice and even to give me a straight reference point. I also made these several inches too long because I figured I'd rather have too many slats than not enough slats. So I think I ended up cutting 4 total off of each one. And then on the first door, I made it relatively thick on the tenon because I'd rather have it too thick than too sloppy when it slides in that groove. So I've been shoulder planing the heck out of this thing to try to get this to sneak up on this tenon. And I measured it, I'm like, oh, I'm actually under my parameters. So then I looked at it again and I measured here and that. I measured this corner and this corner is like a 30-second lower than that corner because it slid well over there, but over here it was so snug. It was the height, not the width of the tenon. So now that we got it working, it's good, but because I took too much off that tenon, it's a little loose, but it still slides efficiently, so it's not that big a deal. Lesson learned for the next one. If it's not working, take a step back, reassess the situation. We're good now. And now that we know that one door works, I'm going to take that door as a reference and make the other door essentially match the same exact height and width of the tenon so everything's uniform. I then carefully cut off the excess and kind of snuck up to a perfect fit in the groove. Then looked over everything to make sure everything fit and slid properly. We removed the excess slats that we did not need, as now we knew exactly where it would end up, and made sure there was enough room for the French pleat on the back. All the other furniture in our home has a hard wax finish on it, so that's what we went with on this one, and this is Osmo. I did 2 coats. And being this will be mounted on the wall, and I needed to keep this back part contained so that the slats wouldn't pop out or rub against anything, I installed these back pieces, and then I just cut them to fit, and then this top one I made a little thicker, as I'm going to cut it in half, and this will make up our French cleat, which is a very simple thing to do. You just cut it at a 45, and then they kind of just lock into each other, and it's the easiest, super strong way to mount things to the wall. And my poor Craig jig hasn't been used in some time, and that's how I'm going to mount these to the back, as I want them removable in case I ever need to service the Tambour doors. I just take out the screws and I can just reassemble it later. I ended up using a 7% step over on these doors to cut the 3D pattern, and it did leave them pretty smooth, but you still have to sand them, and sanding these was absolutely awful. And this thing is looking absolutely beautiful. I'm so happy with how it's turning out, and now to add finish to the doors. This actually ended up not being as bad as I anticipated. I kind of just folded them onto itself and just saturated that end grain. I ended up doing one coat on the entire thing, and then another coat just on the top surface, not between the slats. And I like the Osmo as you can build it up and add a couple coats, and it gives it a nice sheen. And I prefer these types of finishes. There's a lot of them out there now, but I like that you can feel the wood and it still feels like wood versus a big thick layer of multiple coats of epoxy or some other type of lacquer. And I learned so much making this thing. This was actually a warm-up for me. I plan on making a large cabinet like this that's going to live underneath it, and I figured it'd be a good idea to start with the smaller one before just heading straight into a big giant project that uses a bunch of walnut. And this thing just slides perfectly, and I think the next one will be a breeze since I practiced on this smaller one. It'll just be a similar style, but living on the floor and not mounted to the wall, and it'll hold bottles of wine, a coffee maker, different type of coffee stuff, and just other stuff we want to get out of the kitchen. And here's the French cleat in action and the final resting place of this cabinet. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Plans for this build will be available. You won't need a CNC, but the CNC files and all that will be available with the plans. You could make this by hand and just make templates and use a handheld router, but I more so specifically designed it for CNC users, but it could 100% be done with a handheld router and some sort of power carving tool to make the patterns, or just skip the patterns completely.
If you made it this far in the video, thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. I'm new into this whiskey journey, so let me know your favorites or your go-tos down in the comments, and I hope you guys enjoyed the video.